At the height of the British Empire, just before the Second World War, the British Empire covered a fifth of the Earth's surface, and the British monarch ruled directly over a quarter of the world's population. And as you can see, the British Empire was made up of the red bits on this map at its height. And in this short video, I'm going to briefly explore how the British gained and lost this empire, and whether we the British should be ashamed or proud of this defining aspect of our history. Now, the British Empire did not come about because the British government thought they'd try and take over the world. It actually came about through a series of separate events, which meant that the British ended up taking over these different parts of the world. And so I'm going to cover how the British government came to control 3 or 4 of its parts of empire, to give you a flavour of how it came to control so much land. And we'll start off with North America, because North America was one of the first of Britain's colonies that we gained, but also one of the first that we managed to lose in 1776. So it all started with this chap here called Sir Walter Raleigh, who I'm sure you might have heard of. It was one of Queen Elizabeth I's favourites. Was a daring seaman and pirate, and fought against the Spanish when they tried to invade in 1588. And before this, in 1585, Queen Elizabeth gave Sir Walter Raleigh permission to go and establish Britain's first colony in North America, in a land that was called Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen. Now, Sir Walter Raleigh's first attempts at a site called Roanoke failed, but subsequent missions by British colonists were more successful, such as the settlement at Jamestown. But these original colonies were mainly populated by adventurers and traders and trappers that had come over from England to try and win fame and fortune, or win some riches. Families didn't really come over. There weren't any real permanent settlements. But all that changed in the early 1600s, when a group called the Pilgrim Fathers decided to leave England and set up new settlements in the New World, in America. The Puritans at the time, they felt they were being persecuted by the English monarchs. So Queen Elizabeth, in her religious settlement, really wanted people to worship according to the Church of England, which wasn't as didn't have as simple services as Puritans wanted. So famously, they commissioned a ship called the Mayflower and carried the first families to settle in the Americas. Now, it clearly wasn't just the English who were interested in settling North America. The French as well sent over many colonists, and there was a real struggle for power throughout the 1700s, not just in America, but across the world, between the English and the French. And very famously, a young British commander called James Wolfe finally defeated French forces in North America at the Battle of Quebec, and in a famous military victory where the British troops scaled a cliff called the Heights of Abraham to outflank the French forces. And with this defeat, the rest of North America was left open to British colonisation. But the story of how the British took over another part of their empire, how they took over India, is different to the story of how they took over North America. But it was a story that was also started by a Tudor sailor. And this Tudor sailor was called James Lancaster, and he was one of the first captains to sail a boat for a private company called the East India Company. Now, this company was formed to try and find a route to India via the sea. Now, there were already land routes to India, which was the source of many spices which were used at the time to flavour meat, which they couldn't refrigerate, so when it tasted a bit rotten, they'd cover up the flavour with spices. And this was a very lucrative trade. But of course, when it crossed land, there were lots of middlemen to buy and sell the spices. So the East India Company thought, well, if we can sail a boat to India, get the spices direct from source and sell it back without cutting out the middlemen, we'll be able to sell cheaper spices and make a large amount of money. And James Lancaster was the first sailor to sail from Britain around the south of Africa to India to set up this trade route. And it worked. The East India Company became an incredibly wealthy company, and they sent many sailors to India to pick up spices. Now, when the East India Company traders arrived in India, rather than having to sail up and down the coast and try and find the spices themselves, what the company did is they began to build centres for trade. So local spice merchants would come to a central place to sell their spices to the East India Company, and then the East India Company would go to that place to sell the goods back to Britain. And these places were called factories. Now, they didn't produce things like factories back in Britain with chimneys and things, but they were called trading factories. And so here we see one of the East India Company's trading factories, but you'll also see that right next to the East India Company factory there is a Dutch factory as well, because again other European powers were involved in this trade as well. So there's competition between British companies and foreign companies as well. And sometimes this escalated into violence when in one area both companies were vying for the spice trade or trade of other commodities. And sometimes violence would occur between these two companies. And so the East India Company began to create its own army. And they would recruit people from India to fight in their army, and these were called sepoys. Now, as time progressed, these armies grew. The East India Company grew. They took over. They founded more factories in different places in India. They recruited more and more sepoys. Their army grew. The amount of land that they actually owned grew and grew and grew. But eventually, due to the bad treatment of these sepoys, of these Indian soldiers, because of bad treatment of locals, there were quite often rebellions against the East India Company. And the largest of these was in 1857, when there was a huge full-scale mutiny by soldiers who fought for the East India Company, and this spread into a full-scale rebellion against these British and other foreign traders. Now, this mutiny, this rebellion was finally brutally put down, famously by a chap called Clive of India. Was key in leading the British attempts to subdue this rebellion. And one of the key outcomes of this rebellion was that Queen Victoria and the British government decided that the East India Company weren't really up to the job of governing this what was effectively a British colony now themselves. So the British government announced that India was now part of the British Empire. So you can see that the British government didn't set out to go and conquer all of India. It was a private company who took over bits of India for profit, but when they lost control, the British government stepped in. Australia was also part of the British Empire, and again, the British government had no intention of getting an empire in Australia. But a chap called Captain Cook in 1768 set off on a scientific journey. They were going to go and study the planets from the Pacific Ocean. And he set off with a small group of soldiers and some scientists on board a boat to the Pacific. And 2 years later, in 1770, this scientific expedition came across the island or the continent of Australia. And James Cook famously landed in 1770 in Botany Bay, and he claimed the land for the British government. Now, the British government they thought, well, we need settlers for this new land, but it was on the other side of the world, and it was very difficult to convince people to go and settle in these harsh new lands. So they decided that in order to develop this land, to search for resources, to exploit this new territory that they found, they thought it'd be a good destination to send convicts, to send prisoners. Now, at the time, because of overcrowded prisons, many convicts were being kept on old boats anyway, in the Thames and other places in Britain. So this began a policy in late 1700s called transportation, where convicts could be sentenced to be transported to Australia and to be worked hard and quite often worked to death in some of the convict colonies in Australia. But these were the first settlers, the first colonists in Australia. Now, by the beginning of the 1900s, Britain had taken control of large parts of Africa, as this map shows. Now, up till about the 1880s, Britain only controlled a few coastal colonies in West Africa, again to secure trade, to secure factories and trading routes, and also they controlled South Africa in order to ensure that their ships could safely get to India unopposed. And it wasn't only until about the 1880s that Britain began to take over larger parts of Africa, along with many other European powers. Because there began, between 1880 and about 1900, there was a series of events which became known as the Scramble for Africa. And this is where many of the major European powers began to seize parts of Africa, thinking that there'd be lots of wonderful natural resources in the country. For example, Britain took over many more parts of southern Africa, looking to exploit more gold and diamonds. And as more and more European countries began to grab and seize more land in Africa, more and more European powers thought, well, if everybody else is doing it, I should do it as well. Famously, the King of Belgium, when he sent a large expeditionary force to seize a huge area called the Congo, when he was asked why he did this, he said, I just don't want to miss a chance of getting a slice of the cake. And so by 1900, as this map shows, Africa was effectively carved up by all of the major European powers. And this very famous image of one of the British imperialists named Cecil Rhodes, who gave his name to the late independent country of Rhodesia, shows that the kind of attitude at the time, with him showing off, saying, "Look how much of Africa we have managed to seize. Look how the British stand astride Africa like a huge colossus." Now, there's a huge amount of debate about whether how we should remember the British Empire, about whether we should be proud of the British Empire, as people in my dad's generation were taught at school that the British Empire was a great and wonderful thing, or should we actually be ashamed of our colonial past because of the horrors that it brought and the way that it was founded on racism. So I want to share with you a couple of extracts of some work by historians who give their interpretation of what they think about the empire, and want to explore these interpretations a bit more to maybe help you come to your own conclusion. So this is an extract from a book by a historian called Lawrence James. He wrote a book quite recently called The Rise and Fall of the British Empire. And this is an extract from part of his conclusions about the empire. The British Empire was a force for good in the world. The empire was governed for the benefit of its subjects. The empire was never perfect, but colonial rulers were honest and dedicated men who were often respected by colonized people. The British Empire was run according to the rule of law. The British Empire took science and technology to many different parts of the world. British built railways, bridges, and canals improved communications in many territories. Hospitals and medical centres led to better healthcare. Colonised people were educated in British schools and attended Christian churches. English was widely spoken throughout the empire, and this means the former British colonies are in a strong position to trade and prosper in the modern world. So Lawrence James there shares an attitude of many historians that actually the British government, the British Empire, was a good thing for the people of the world. And let's just unpick that a bit and have a look at the history which Lawrence James founds that on. So there were indeed many hospitals founded by missionaries who went throughout the empire to try and spread Christianity. And these hospitals did indeed, especially in the 20th century, begin to improve healthcare in many parts of the empire. For example, this is a photograph taken from a leprosy hospital in India, which was founded by missionaries. So the empire did improve the medical care for many people in its empire, or those people who could actually access the hospitals, because they weren't widely distributed throughout the empire. And railways were built throughout the empire. In most British colonies, there were railways that were built, and these helped carry huge quantities of goods and supplies across colonies. For example, in India, it meant that cotton could be carried in huge quantities to Delhi and Calcutta. In Canada, where railways were built from across the continent, from coast to coast, it meant that its prairies became inhabitable by settlers. It meant that they could grow grain that could be taken easily to towns and sold. So it helped the development of towns. And these railway networks and canal networks are quite often still the backbone of transportation systems in many former colonies. And the settlers in many colonies did begin to industrialise as well, and factories in some of the British colonies began to appear in the late 19th century and early 20th century to further the economic development of those colonies. And just as hospitals began to appear, being founded by missionaries, also schools were set up across the empire. And these schools did provide a formal education to children in the empire where there was none before. And many parents were really keen to see their children go to these schools because they were seen as a route to get a better job and a better standard of living. And in many of the British colonies, there was an educated elite was created from people living in the colonies, mainly to help the British run the colony, administer the colony, but many people in the colonies did receive a good quality of education. And these missionaries that we've talked about wanted to spread the word of God. Many religious people at the time believed that if you did not believe in the word of God, then you would burn in hell forever. Christians still believe that. And so one of the main functions of empire, the British government said, was to spread Christianity. And the missionaries were very successful in this. In fact, the Church of England today serves more worshippers in Africa than it does in England. But not all historians agree with Lawrence James in this interpretation that the British Empire was a good thing for the people of the world. So I'd like to share this extract from a book by a historian called Dennis Judd, in his again recent history book called Empire, who reached a different conclusion to Lawrence James about the empire. The British Empire was a force for bad in the world. When imperialists boasted that the sun never set on the British Empire, critics said it was because God didn't trust the British in the dark. The British Empire could never be based on consent. Territories were annexed to serve British needs, not to improve the lives of colonised people. Imperial rule damaged the economies of different colonies. Before colonialisation, many territories were self-sufficient for food. Under British rule, colonies were often dependent on one cash crop, such as rubber, sugar, or coffee. After independence, a sharp fall in the price of these crops could result in poverty and hunger for millions of people. Perhaps the worst damage was the self-esteem of colonised people. The British treated the people they ruled like children. To be ruled by people from a distant land who often tried to destroy aspects of your culture was a humiliating experience. So let's have a look at the history to see what evidence there is to support Dennis Judd's interpretation. Well, the first terrible thing that the British brought with them when they began to colonise an area was disease. And this was particularly evident in the New World, in the Americas. When white settlers arrived in America, they brought with them many new diseases which the local inhabitants had never encountered before, so their bodies didn't have the antibodies to fight these diseases. One of the biggest killers was smallpox, that historians estimate killed millions of indigenous people in North America and wiped out many of the locals in the places where the first English settlements were. And this pattern was repeated by the British as they set up colonies around the world. For example, again, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Aborigines in Australia were killed by similar diseases. So the claims that the British brought good healthcare and better health to the people that they encountered is often contested, because the number of people they saved in these hospitals is nothing compared to the numbers that were killed by the diseases that the British brought. And just as in on the Caribbean, where the slaves worked on huge sugar plantations across the empire, there were large plantations which may not have used slave labour, but was the same principle of just planting one large cash crop, which could be sold. For example, coffee or rubber, for example. And these large plantations selling these cash crops are quite often the backbone of the economy of many former colonies. So this means, for example, if you are just have huge plantations growing rubber, that if the international market on rubber collapses and people don't want to pay very much for rubber anymore, then suddenly your whole country's economy is destroyed. And many countries nowadays are still feeling this pressure on their economy. Their economies can't take off because it's just relying on one product, and a good healthy economy needs lots of products to grow to thrive. Now, also, many people say the British Empire was a good thing because it brought kind of industrialization and modernization to parts of the world. But you'll notice that in these images of industrialization from across the empire, that they feature white workers, because quite often the British government didn't want parts of its empire to industrialise. They feared that if they allowed factories to develop in their colonies, that these factories might be able to produce goods at cheaper costs than British factories can, and it might put many British companies out of business. There's also people think that due to the racist attitudes of the British government at the time. They didn't want to put too much power in the hands of the people they ruled over by building factories and making lots of money from the goods they produced, because it meant they wouldn't be able to control them as well. So even though there was some industrialization in some of the white colonies, such as Canada and Australia, for the rest of the colonies the British government ruled over, there wasn't actually that much industrialization. In fact, it was positively it was positively banned in many areas. I've talked about schools maybe being a positive force of the British Empire, but many actually see the rolling out of education by the British as quite a destructive thing. British schools taught exclusively English, British history, British culture, and completely ignored any language or culture or history that any of the people we ruled over might have had. And so it was in effect a way of trying to just ignore any local cultural history that existed, and imposing the British version of events on people. But even if you think, well, actually, maybe education was still a good thing to let them get on with the world, it was only a tiny proportion of children in the colonies that actually received this education. Probably less than 1%. And so actually, this wasn't something that was open to the vast majority of people that the British ruled over. What made think this worse was that actually all law courts, all laws were published in English. Law courts were carried out in English, and because so few of the people the British ruled over could actually speak English, it meant they didn't have access to the law. So whereas Lawrence James argues that the rule of law was a foundation of the British Empire, actually, because the huge majority of people could not speak English, they didn't have access to law. Now, I've asked a couple of times through this video the question about whether the British should be proud or ashamed of its empire. I just thought I'd share my point of view with you as somebody who is British, who's come up through the British education system. And I actually am incredibly ashamed of my country's past with the British Empire. I think that although I do understand the argument that we brought many good things to our colonies, for example, transportation, industrialization, and perhaps some more positive aspects of our culture. Actually, I think it's very arrogant of us to assume that these peoples that we colonized would not have come up with these solutions themselves, that they would not have come up with alternative and better solutions than the ones that we imposed on them. And I think that whatever good we did in the empire, it is completely outweighed to the brutality and hardship we brought to many of the people we colonized, the way that we stripped these colonies of their culture, and the way that we had this condescending attitude and racist attitude towards the people that we ruled. So I do appreciate, I do understand the role the British Empire has played in forming the Britain that we have today, but it is a part of our history that I personally am very ashamed of. So not surprisingly, many inhabitants of these British colonies protested against British rule. Perhaps the most famous of these is Mohandas Gandhi, who in the middle of the 20th century led endless protests against the British government in India. And he did it in a very particular non-violent way to highlight the nonsense of British rule. One example of this is that the British government in India made lots of money out of charging tax on salt that is sold to the Indian people. And in order to get this money, they banned people from picking up salt. And on many beaches in India, salt just forms naturally from the sea washing in and then the sea evaporating, leaving large salt deposits. And it was against the law for Indian people just to pick up these lumps of salt on the beach. So famously, Gandhi walked with a large group of people. He had international press coverage covering this march, and he told the British government he was going to pick up some salt on this beach. And when this happened, and his subsequent arrest, this was all captured on film and distributed around the world, and it just showed the nonsense of some of the British rules. But even though it would tell a good story that it was Gandhi's protests that actually forced the British out of India, it wasn't really the main driving force behind the ending of the British Empire, not just in India, but also across the globe. Was with the end of the Second World War. The British, after the Second World War, were financially bankrupt. They were militarily exhausted, and they just simply had no resources left after fighting Nazism to actually run an empire. And so in the 1940s, across the world, they began to withdraw from their colonies across the world, and quite often they would leave behind chaos in their wake, because they would quickly draw up maps of new independent countries such as Iraq and Pakistan. And these borders weren't very well thought about. It wasn't very well thought about how peoples would move to these new lands. And so, for example, when India gained its independence, the new country of Pakistan was created. The Muslim population of India all moved to Pakistan, and the Hindu population of Pakistan all moved out of Pakistan into India. And where these two groups met, there was huge amounts of bloodshed, and again, millions of people needlessly lost their lives. And these rushed maps that the British created when they left their empire still means there are lots of border disputes and wars across the globe today. So there we go. That's the end of a quick history of the British Empire. There are so many stories of both brutality and heroism that I haven't had time to include. But I hope it gives you an understanding of some of the key issues in this difficult but really crucial part of history.